Hello, this is Stephen Nojiri, and this is another Tada Genji tradition video. Actually, this is going to be a video series about Kumazawa Banzan. This is the first video in this series, and this series will seek to explore the dynamics of the failures of the Tokugawa shogunate, also known as the Edo period government, and how these failures interacted with the samurai sort of socio-economic realities. And by samurai we mean employed samurai, but we're also referring to ronin as well, and how these failures also interacted with the commoners. So that would be in regards to riots and uprisings, things like that. And finally, how these failures interacted with the way that Edo period policies conflicted with the older pre-Edo policies or pre-Edo cultures, pre-Edo teachings. Now, the purpose of these videos is really fourfold. There's going to be four key aspects. So these videos seek to educate the viewer on some historical figures, such as Kumazawa Banzan, who's the key figure bringing all of these videos in the series together, Kumazawa Morihisa, his adopted father, Nojiri Kazutoshi, his father, etc., etc., etc. Basically, we're going to look at a brief summary of his life and his teachings and how all of this interplays with the socio-economic and cultural realities of the time. And in doing that, you're going to learn a little bit of biographical information about the key figures involved. So that's the first reason of the videos, is to educate you on that. The second purpose is to educate the viewer on the nature of riots and uprisings pre-Edo and during the Edo period. So there will be a video that looks at that. We're going to look at peasant uprisings and the pre-Edo and during the Edo period, because they're very different creatures depending on the time period that they take place. Another purpose of the videos will be to educate and to explain what the Tada Genji and the Kusunoki traditions teach about these riots and uprisings and how it relates to Kumazawa's stances on such things. And as I said earlier, this will ultimately go back to show sort of the failures of the Tokugawa shogunate and how all of these different things interrelate. And then the final, or the fourth, purpose of these series is to educate and expose the viewer to Kumazawa Banzan's work known as the Daigaku Wakuman, which is his final work, and in so many ways really encapsulates not only his view, but sort of the view that really should have been in place at the time, but wasn't in place because of the failures of the Tokugawa shogunate. So this first video, aside from the introduction that we just covered, is also going to do the very brief biographies over key individuals. So these individuals are basically chosen, again, as I said, due to their relation to Kumazawa Banzan and the overall timeline we're looking at. So first off, a very brief look at Kumazawa Banzan himself. He was born as a Nojiri. He was adopted by Kumazawa Morihisa, who was his maternal grandfather. He was employed by Ikeda Mitsumasa on and off throughout his life, wandering as a ronin when not in service to Ikeda. While employed, he was a gunnery commander. He was also a secretary. We're going to go more into detail about this. This is a very brief overview. The key point, he was also a Confucian scholar. This is the key point here. He wrote many texts and, upon request, traveled to many provinces to assist the daimyo of those provinces with social or infrastructural reforms. He almost got arrested from the Yui Shosetsu rebellion, and he is eventually put on house arrest by the shogunate. Now, and the next video is actually going to go over a brief timeline of his life. So that's just a brief introduction. But he's our key figure here, Kumazawa Banzan, the Ronin Confucian scholar of the 1600s. The next figure we're going to briefly look at is Kumazawa Morihisa, chief retainer to Fukushima Masanori. Morihisa was also the person who was supposed to be the Southern Court Emperor. But instead, he's serving as Fukushima Masanori's chief retainer. Now, he was originally an Oda retainer, serving under Shibata Katsui, but When Shibata died, he then entered service. He entered into Fukushima Masanori's service. And as some of you may be aware, so that basically means he goes from being a very solid Oda retainer to being a very solid Toyotomi retainer. Then, when the Tokugawa shogunate strips Fukushima of the Hiroshima province and orders Fukushima to Shinano, Morihisa actually prepares a very violent resistance against the shogun's forces. Fukushima Masanori had to actually intervene and talk Morihisa down. And this was kind of a good thing, though, because when Fukushima Masanori was en route from Hiroshima to Shinano, the Tokugawa actually sent assassins to kill Fukushima en route, and it was Morihisa and his group that stopped that assassination. When Fukushima passed away in 1624, a few members of the Kumazawa family stayed employed with the Fukushima clan, but Morihisa himself moved to the Mito domain after being invited to the Mito domain for employment by the Matsudaira branch that is in Mito. And just a little bit of historical information here. The fact that Morihisa was able to be reemployed by the Mito Matsudaira and not become a Ronin shows or evidences that Fukushima Masanori, near his own death, had to have given Morihisa permission to be reemployed when Fukushima died. So that's a little bit of historical fact there, a little bit of a nugget, so to speak, of interesting information. And next up is Nojiri Kazutoshi, who is Kumazawa Banzan's biological father. He was a Ronin. When Banzan was born in 1619, Kazutoshi was working as a Ronin. And actually, Kazutoshi pretty much works as a Ronin his entire life. So Kazutoshi is actually married to Kumazawa Morihisa's daughter. And this is how, and basically, remember when I said that Banzan was adopted by his maternal grandfather. So that's that connection there. Kazutoshi, like I said, lived the life of a Ronin, a samurai mercenary, and throughout Banzan's life, he would meet with his son, Ronin father to Ronin son, to exchange stories and ideas and teachings. Now, Kazutoshi fought, it is believed, as a pro-Toyotomi mercenary during the siege of Osaka, which makes sense because this also puts him fighting alongside other Nojiri who had been sent by Fukushima Masanori in secret to support the Toyotomi faction. We also know that he fought during the Shimabara Rebellion as a mercenary hired by Lord Itacura. Now, he was hired by Lord Itacura, but he ends up fighting under the banner of Lord Nabashime at Shimabara. Now, during the rebellion, Kazutoshi takes a bullet wound, and that's kind of the end of his time at Shimabara. And after this, he meets up with Banzan, and while recovering from his bullet wound, he teaches Banzan pretty much all that he knows about Genji tradition, Southern Court, etc., etc. All of his warrior traditions he passes on to him while he's recovering from this bullet wound. It's recorded that he eventually passes away rather peacefully as an old man while visiting Ikeda Mitsumasa, or visiting his son when his son's in service to Ikeda Mitsumasa. And Ikeda Mitsumasa is number 4 on our list. He's the lord of the Okayama domain. He is the lord who hires Banzan on and off over the years. Sometimes Banzan's working as serving him, sometimes Banzan's wandering around as a Ronin, but every time that Banzan is actually employed under a lord, it's Ikeda Mitsumasa. So much so that Banzan actually adopts Mitsumasa's third son. So Mitsumasa's third son becomes Kumazawa Banzan's adopted son. It should also be noted that Mitsumasa was an avid Kusunoki Ryu student. Next up we have Nakae Toju and Hayashi Ranzan. So these two are, I encourage you to Google them to get a lot of information about them because we won't go into them too much. But you should basically know that Nakae is basically the Confucian scholar who was the teacher of Banzan, and Hayashi Razan is basically the enemy to Nakai and becomes Banzan's enemy as well. But looking at him specifically, Nakai is the sage of the Omi province. He's a Confucian scholar who influenced Banzan early in Banzan's Confucian path. He teaches or taught a form of Confucianism that transcends gender, transcends social status, and this kind of makes his teachings fairly radical during the 1600s. The primary focus or influence on these teachings was the Yomei Gaku, or the Yangming type of Confucianism, which is a type of Neo-Confucianism that began entering Japan as a consequence of the Toyotomi Korean campaign. So when all of these samurai go into Korea, then Japan begins to be exposed to Neo-Confucianism. And with that Neo-Confucianism comes this Yangming, or this Yomei Gaku version of Confucianism. So Banzan studied Nakai's Toju's works and even spent time studying with him directly. And he got along well and he agreed on many of his points, but Banzan's Confucianism is distinct and doesn't mirror the Yomei Gaku as much as Nakai's teaching. So he was Toju's student, but he grows and changes beyond that and becomes his own distinct form of Confucianism. Now, number 6, Hayashi Razan is the Confucian political advisor to the Tokugawa shoguns until he dies in the late 1650s. He is responsible essentially for the form of Confucianism espoused by the Tokugawa shogunate. Hayashi was definitely Nakai's rival and definitely a rival to Banzan. Not just sort of an ideological rival, but also a political rival, an economic rival, to the point where Hayashi tried to get Banzan arrested on many occasions. So definitely a dangerous rival in that regard. And we'll close with 8 and 9. 8 being Yui Shosetsu, and 9 will be Lord Itacura and Lord Nabashime. So Yui Shosetsu, he is the Ronin who inherited Kusunoki Fuden's family line and school after Kusunoki Fuden's assassination. Fuden and Yui would often meet with and give Gungaku instruction to the Kishu domain's lord Tokugawa Yorinobu. Banzan would also occasionally meet with Fuden, Yui, and Tokugawa Yorinobu. So they were comrades, they were associates. Yui Shosetsu, however, organizes a rebellion, a Ronin rebellion in the early 1650s. And this basically left his branch family and his school in ruins. It also caused Tokugawa Yorinobu to be placed on house arrest. Banzan was almost also arrested due to being an associate. In fact, Hayashi Razan took this opportunity to begin to fiercely target Banzan's stances on Confucianism and really painted Banzan as being as Banzan's teachings as being a fuel for rebellions. Now number 9, Lord Itacura and Lord Nabashime. So Lord Itacura was the one who arranged for Banzan to be a retainer of Lord Ikeda. Lord Itacura also led the army against the rebels at Shimabara. Nojiri Kazutoshi, Banzan's biological father, had been hired by Lord Itacura, and by some accounts he was assigned to serve Lord Nabashime while he was hired to fight in the Shimabara forces. So Lord Itacura was the top commander. Lord Nabashime was the subordinate general commander. Now, we also have a different Itacura. So Lord Itacura Shigemasa dies at Shimabara. However, another member of the family, Itacura Shigemune, would also protect Banzan. And there is actually, in the 1650s, there was a plot to arrest Banzan in Edo, and it was actually Itacura Shigemune who contacted Banzan and warned him of this plot. So then Banzan did not travel to Edo and did not get arrested.